Pasuk Chofal that said you're not permitted to plant an Asherah. That's an idolatrous type tree next to the Mizbeach. Collates, any type of tree or any permanent structure in the base of Migdosh next to the Mizbeach. So the Baal Turim explains Asherah, the Gematria Dain Sheina Hogun. It's Gemara Sanhedrin. A Dain, if you appoint inappropriate, unqualified Dayan to convene and adjudicate cases, it's like planting the Asherah next to the Mizbach Hashem Elokecha. Okay? So Asherah is Dain Sheina Hogun, but if you point such a Dayan, it's as if you placed the Asherah next to the Mizbeach. We've discussed this many times. You will never find the appellation of Elokim associated with Korban. It's always Korban Lashem. Yud-Kei Vav-Kei is Midas HaRachmim. So the whole concept of Korban, which is Kapara, you only have Kapara within the context of Midas HaRachmim. Within Midas Adin, there's no such thing as Kapara to be reinstated. Tshuva, also, which is rehabilitative, which is reinstatement if a person does Tshuva, it's Midas HaRachmim. It's a chesed. It's a chesed based on psukim in Tilim. It's God's kindness that a person, although he crosses many lines which are unforgivable, that if a person has true remorse and commits himself not to go back there, he's fully atoned and reinstated. Korban, for certain sins, you need, tshuva is not enough, you need the korban. The korban has to complete the reinstatement. But that process of reinstatement is spiritual rehabilitation. It's Midas HaRachmim. So the Mizbeach represents the concept of what? Of Midas HaRachmim. If you plant the Asherah next to the Mizbeach, the Beis HaMikdash does not function within the context of what Midas HaRachmim. It doesn't activate Rachmim. Meaning, not only does it activate Rachmim, you're stuck where you are, and not only that, you regress, you don't go forward. That's the concept. We've mentioned Medrash very often, based on the Gemara. The Gemara says that a dayan who's done din emes mito, a dayan who adjudicates a case, and the verdict is truth, beyond truth, absolute truth, beyond question, he's Hashem's partner in creation. He becomes God's partner in Ma'aseh Bereshis. But if you go and you corrupt the justice, even as much as one penny, Hashem says, I will take your soul. Hashem says, I will take the life of that dayan. Even though he only caused a person to give up a cent. You steal $1 million. God forbid a person steals that kind of money, embezzles that kind of money. Hashem doesn't say, I'm going to take your soul. But the dayan who renders a corrupt verdict, Hashem says, I will take your soul. Why? So if he does the right thing, Hashem says, you're my partner in creation. If not, I will take your soul. What exactly is the level of culpability to this degree that Hashem says he deserves that his life should be taken? So we explained that initially, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when he created the world, he wanted to create the world Midas Adin, not Midas HaRachmim. That's why quite a few psukim at the beginning of Bereshis, it's Elokim. Bereshis bar Elokim, V'yomer Elokim, continuously Elokim. Elokim is the appellation of Midas Adin. So then it says, when he comes to the creation of Adam, it says Hashem Elokim. Why Hashem Elokim? Yud-Kei Vav-Kei is Midas HaRachmim, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu saw that the world cannot survive with the exactness of din, because man is prone to fail. Therefore, Hashem coalesced into judgment the Midas HaRachmim. Otherwise, the world cannot continue. But the initial intent was Midas Adin. Why is it Midas Adin? If things are created with Midas Adin, that means you weed out all the impurities of the system. it's an exact system. A person speaks Lashon Hara, he loses his power of speech. Person steals, he loses the function of his hand. That's Midas Adin. Immediately, there's judgment. There's no forgiveness. You receive what you deserve. But if that would be the case, after a short period of time, you're not going to have humanity, because man are prone to not be, they're far from perfect. Therefore, he called this Midas HaRachmi. That's the Chazal. But we see from here that it's vital that things should function within the context of justice. You have to have justice. So Hashem says, although there's not going to be divine justice, because divine justice, humanity cannot survive, but there has to be human justice. Who is human justice given over to supervise that and to facilitate that? That's the Beis Din. That was given over to Klal Yisrael, the Dayanim who are ordained, that have certain qualifications, and they rule within certain systems. Those systems are the equivalent of Midas Adin, the heavenly Midas Adin. That's Midas Adin on the terrestrial level. And that allows the world to function within that state where it's the closest thing to perfection, within human perfection. But it's this Dayanim have to work and operate within the systems that Hashem provided. That's Din Shalmato. That's the terrestrial Din. Because Din is crucial and essential for the function of the world. What happens if the Dayan doesn't carry through? And there is no Din Shalmato. So the Medrash says, if there's no Din Shalmato, there's Din Shalmala. God says you have to have justice. If there's no human justice working within the systems of Hashem, and that's the reason we mentioned, that's the reason when the Dayan convenes, it's Elokim Nitzav V'Naskel. Hashem is involved in rendering that decision, that it's God's, the Dayan see through God's eyes. Because the Din Shal Mata is the equivalent of Din Shal Mala. God is involved in that Midas Adin. What happens if the Dayan is corrupt? God is not involved in that process. If that's the case, Hashem says, I have to take it in my own hands. Once Hashem takes it in his own hands, what happens? Then there's Din Shal Mala. Then there's heavenly justice, which ultimately is what? In exactness, which the world's going to suffer terribly. So who's the cause of the world's suffering? The judge who's not functioning within the system. So he's the cause of what? Din Shal Mala. So the death and the suffering, he's what? He's the cause of that, because he did not operate and function within the capacity that he was meant to function. So the Midas HaRachmim, which is provided to the world due to the Din Shal Mata, now is not there, because now there's Din Shal Mala. The Mizbeach represents what? Mizbeach represents Midas HaRachmim. But if you plant that Asherah tree next to the Mizbeach, what happens? That's idolatry. That means the Mizbeach no longer functions within the context of Midas HaRachmim. So the kapara that you need for rehabilitation on a spiritual level for reinstatement is not there, because the Asherah is there. Asherah kolates, Asherah, b'gematria dain shein hogun. If you have the dain shein hogun, it's the equivalent of planting that Asherah next to the Mizbeach. Just as when you have the Asherah near the Mizbeach doesn't function within the context of Midas HaRachmim to bring about kapara. Identically, the dain shein hogun, the dain who's not qualified and doesn't function and operate within the systems, he actually brings Midas HaRachmim to a standstill, and now there's Midas Adin. Just as the Mizbeach doesn't operate when you have the Asherah, when you have the dain shein hogun, the Midas HaRachmim is not in place. Therefore, he's the equivalent of planting the Asherah next to the Mizbeach. What is Midas Adin? So Ramchal explains, we know that Rosh Hashanah is Yom Adin, Day of Judgment. What does Day of Judgment mean? Day of Judgment means nobody has a perfect record. As Shlomo says in Koheles, ain't tzaddik or it's a sheyasto lo yechto. There's no perfect tzaddik. So every person has a flawed record. So if that's the case, why is Midas HaRachmim in place? Because the only time Midas Adin is activated when Hashem allows Satan, who's the prosecutor of the world, the prosecutor of Klal Yisrael, to audit the record. If the record is audited by the auditor who's the prosecutor, then Hashem pays attention to that shortcoming on that record. and something has to be done. The Sultan continuously comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and says, the record is far from perfect. And he continuously pounds on Hashem's door. Kavayochel. They deserve to be, the record is so flawed, it has to be audited. Hashem says, I don't want to hear about it. I don't want you talking about my children. I don't want to hear about it. On Rosh Hashanah, which is Day of Judgment, the Sultan has the floor. In his full glory, he comes and he prosecutes. And it's serious. It's a serious moment, as we say in the Sana Tokef. Malachim yechofezun, the Malachim, they rush, they tremble from the harshness of the Midas Adin in heaven. What happens? We have the schus of the Akedah. The moment, the Gemara says, the moment the shofar is sounded, it silences the prosecution of Satan. That's why the shofar is so valuable. That's Elu Shel Yitzchak. That's the ram that was brought in Yitzchak's stead. That silences the prosecution. Now, what happens if during the year, which it's not the Yom Adin, the record becomes too off balance? Too off balance. What happens? Hashem can't keep shut out. He has to listen to the prosecution. And if Sutton's able to prosecute, God forbid, it's disastrous. It's catastrophic. Because the moment he prosecutes, Hashem allows those failings to take effect due to his prosecution. So what does he do? And it's Gemara Psochim. We find that when the Yamsuf closed on the Egyptians, the Jews themselves were concerned that maybe the Egyptians are coming around from the other side and they're going to be trapped. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu had the sea spit out the remains of all the Egyptians on the seashore. And when they saw the remains of the Egyptians, they said the Oz Yoshir. That's what the Gemara says. That's what happened. So what happens? The Sarah Shal Yam, the angel that was created for the ocean to supervise, and the ocean comes to Hashem. He says that all these remains of the human beings, they were all meant to be food for the fish in the sea, and that's my responsibility. So by having the sea cast out the remains, all these bodies are not going to be there. Hashem says, I'm going to make it up to you. In the future, when there's going to be the battle of Barak and Devorah against Sisera, who was the Assyrian general, it says the Nachal, the river, came out and swept them off the terrestrial level and swept them into the river. Those remains will make up for the remains that are here today. When you receive that, that'll be a compensation which you're not having today. But today, I have to show my children that the Egyptians died. That's a Gemara in Psochim. Satan says, I want a pound of flesh. The Jews deserve to give a pound of flesh and more than that. Hashem says, not a problem. You'll have your pound of flesh. So what very often, one of two things happens. Either HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes a tzaddik, as the Gemara tells us. There were tzaddikim that were the equivalent of 36 of the Sanhedrin. 36, like the Gemara says, that we went to Ai to conquer Canaan. There was 36 casualties due because somebody had taken from the spoils of Jericho. So the Gemara says there weren't 36. There was a person who was the equivalent of the majority of the Sanhedrin, who was the equivalent of 36 Dayanim who will sit on the Sanhedrin Gedolah. So when we speak about numbers, we're not talking about quantitative necessarily, it's even qualitative value. So very often HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes a tzaddik to silence the prosecution of Satan. And that's the Gemara in Tainus. The Gemara says that tzaddikim is mechaper. The passing of tzaddikim atones for the generation that silences the prosecution. This is the concept. That's what happens. So if you have a dying, so we have Midas Rachmim in place. Midas Rachmim, the Korban, silences the prosecution of Satan. The Korban reinstates us. The basis, the record is cleansed. Whatever that flaw was, whatever that mark is, negative, is removed. If there's tshuva, you bring the Korban. But if you can't bring the Korban, there's part of that's still on your record. This is what to prosecute. But if the Mizbeach doesn't function, you can't take it off the record. So something has what to prosecute. Therefore, it's Midas Adin. The Dayan, who's meant to function in a certain capacity, to work within the systems, which is the equivalent of Din, but Din Shel Mato, he allows Midas HaRachman to be in place. The moment there's no longer Din on the terrestrial level, as it says in the Medrash, it means Din Lamato, which is necessary, and Hashem's involved in that process, Yish Din Lamalo. Then there's heavenly justice. And what heavenly justice means, Hashem allows something to prosecute. When he prosecutes, God forbid, that means that's Churban. The world is bordering on destruction. The suffering, the death, everything else. And who's culpable for this? The Dayan who did not function as he was meant to function. So the gematria of Asherah, which is the idolatrous tree, is what? Is Dayan Sheina Hogum. That's the question.
May I trouble you to please distinguish between Satan and Hashem's attribute of justice?
Okay. We speak about, we say it many times, we come to Slichus, we have the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachmim, the 13 attributes of mercy. Hashem, Ki HaRachmim Chanun. Then we say, No say Ovon V'Fesher Chato. He carries Ovon, the deliberate sin. Pesha is the defiant sin, and Chato is the inadvertent sin. What does it mean? He carries it. What does it mean Hashem carries it? That's one of the attributes of Rachmim. So the Ramak, we once studied Talmud Dvorah, explains, and we discussed this within Rav Chaim Voloshanov. We read in Pirkei Avos, Avera Goreres Avera. When you do a sin, one sin encourages another sin. It brings another sin about. How does it work? So he explains, based on the Zohar, Rav Chaim Voloshanov, that when you sin, you create a negative force, an impure force. That impure force touches us and goes within our spiritual system, and it's like taking a foreign substance, and it causes you to crave more of the same. So if you sin, and you have traces of that sin in your system, it encourages more of the same. You crave more of the same. That's the concept of Avera Goreres Avera. When a person does tshuva, you actually vaporize. You detox the system. If you really do appropriate tshuva, whatever that impurity which was generated by the sin, whatever that impurity is, it's no longer there. Tshuva cleanses the spiritual system. Now, the Ramak says like this: what's Midas HaRachman, what's Midas Adin? He explains you have a leech. You have a leech and you put it onto the human body. When could you peel off the leech off the body or off the living creature? When the leech is filled with blood, then you can peel it off. But until it reaches its maximum saturation, you can't take it off. Every force, everything in existence has to be sustained. Otherwise, it can't exist. Hashem sustains everything. Now, Hashem sustains what he created. What about if you create a foreign element which represents evil? What should Hashem say? You know something? You created, the example, you created the mamzer, you support the mamzer. He gives an example. A person, God forbid, fathers an illegitimate child, and the child looks exactly like the father. And he goes to the charity and says, could you support my child? They said, the child is your child. You take care of it. He says, it's not my child. He says, how is it not your child? Its features are identical to you. It's your mom's. You take care of your mom's. We're not taking care of your mom's. You're an illegitimate child. Midas Adin says, you created this evil force because it was only you chose to do evil. You sustained it yourself. So how do you sustain such a force? That impure force attaches itself to the soul, which is the closest thing to God itself. It's an entity of holiness, and it saps it. And it'll sap it to the point that it's satisfied until finally it's just totally withers. But the consequence of that is the person spiritually and physically is so handicapped, he barely can continue functioning. And if you have a few such situations where the consequence of the sin, that a pure force which has to be sustained, attaches itself, a person cannot survive it. Cannot survive it. Humanly, you cannot survive, you die. What is the Midas HaRachmim? Hashem says, despite the fact that you should be the one responsible to sustain that impure force for the sake of humanity to be able to continue, I will carry that force. No say ovo, I will carry the deliberate sin. Although it was done intentionally, although it wasn't defiance, I will carry the sin. I will sustain it. As I sustain everything else, I will sustain that to give you a chance to continue to do good things and eventually to do tshuva. And if you do tshuva, you will eradicate, vaporize that force. That's midas harachman, no say ovo. V'fesha, even if it's defiant, even if you do it defiantly, I will carry that. Because even on a more extreme level, it's more difficult to survive. I will even carry that. Of chato, even the chet, which you think is inconsequential, so maybe you should carry that. I will not let you to be hindered and minimized even as much as an iota. Even the chato I will carry. That it's as if you're sin-free. We function as if we're sin-free. Because Hashem carries all the carrying force, sustains all these forces that we created. That's midas harachmim. The moment the son prosecutes, and he says, the record has to be audited, Hashem stops carrying that sin to a degree. It's based on the degree of prosecution. The moment Hashem stops sustaining that force, the catastrophic consequences, whether it's illness, whether it's heart attack, whether it's cancer, whether it's who knows what, but that's only as a result that Hashem is no longer sustaining that force, and therefore the force attaches itself to the person. Therefore, whenever we say we make a mishaberach for a person who's not well, we say refuas hanefesh, refuas haguf, healing the soul and healing the body. The illness or the shortcoming within the system in the physical sense emanates from the nefesh, because the nefesh has been attacked, which is the spirituality. This force has already attached itself to some degree. Therefore, the nefesh has to be healed, and if the nefesh is healed, then you have refuas haguf, then the body is healed. One is a direct outgrowth of the other. So sudden doesn't punish. Sudden is only the prosecutor, which causes the midas harachmim. Hashem should stop carrying and sustaining those negative forces. Therefore, we are the affected, and consequentially, we are minimized with those forces, which we created. You're credited for it. It's a mitzvah. After rehabilitation, you're even at a more advanced level because you came to realization of the wrong and you have remorse, therefore puts you on a higher pedestal. Says Ein Odom Nokif Etzbo Lamato. You do not stub your finger on the terrestrial level, unless it was pronounced from above that you should stub your finger. You do not stub your finger. You get out of bed accidentally, you hit your toe on the wall, and you see stars, and you have excruciating pain. You say, I should have been more careful. The reason why it happened, because very often we're not careful, it doesn't happen. Because at that moment, it was pronounced from heaven that that's what should happen. Now, why was it pronounced? You're a tzaddik. Why do you deserve it? The answer is, it's part of the kapara. That's called yisurim. Hashem gives us yisurim. Hopefully, they're not too painful. That's part of the atonement process. Because that's payment of debt. And if we pay debt at a lesser level, and especially if it alerts us, then we maximize on that. It's an opportunity. So whenever anything happens, if the mindset is, I'll tell you a story. I was in Lakewood, and it was the Shabbos. I was still in my shiva, and I went to shul on Shabbos with my son-in-law, and somehow I tripped, and Shabbos, you wear Shabbos clothing, although it was during my shiva, and I tripped, and I did a somersault, literally. And Baruch Hashem, I only hurt my wrist. I literally did a somersault. And I got up right away. I was okay. As I was doing that somersault, what I thought in my mind, ein Adam noikif etzbo lamatam kemachriz no mala. That the reason why it happens, I wasn't careful, this, that, a lot of times you're not careful, but you don't fall that way. Why did I fall that way? Because at that moment, it was pronounced from above, that's what was supposed to happen. So if I acknowledge that, then I'm maximizing on that experience. That experience now has delivered the message, and I understand the message. So I've given value to what happened at that moment. That's the concept. Last year was a tragic year for the Jewish people. What's going on since October 7th, right? The last day of what? Of Yom Tov is the end of the Regel. This tragedy begins, and it still hasn't finished. The casualties, the suffering, the upheavals, the world globally, it's totally exploded. So the Aruch LaNer says like this: shofar silences the prosecution of Satan. So what happens if Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos? We don't blow the shofar. But why don't we blow the shofar? We don't blow the shofar because we're concerned that a person who's not adept in blowing the shofar, mistakenly, he may take the shofar without thinking and transport in public domain. So the Shabbos should not be desecrated. That's the reason why we don't have the schus of the Arcade in place to silence the prosecution of Satan. So there's word from Rameir Simcha Vince, but if shofar is so essential, crucial, how do we deal with the prosecution of Satan? It's the day of judgment, which means he has a right to audit that record. We're helpless. What do we do? How do we somehow stand up against Satan's prosecution? So Rameir Simcha Vince says that why don't we blow shofar? Because there's a concern. Somebody may transport that shofar 4 cubits in public domain. So Rameir Simcha Vince says, how many Jews do you think are going to do that? This almost inadvertently, a handful. So what are Chazal saying? For the sake of Shabbos not being desecrated, even by a handful of people, inadvertently, it's worthwhile to give up the merit of the shofar to silence. For the sake of Hashem's glory, willing to give it all up. That Hashem's glory should not be desecrated. That Shabbos not be desecrated. That's so Satan comes to prosecute, says, I want to talk about your children's flawed record. Hashem says, you're talking about my children. You know who my children are? They're willing to give up every defense for my honor. And he takes him, throws him out on his head. He shuts him down, and that's all. So the not blowing shofar on Shabbos is a greater counterforce to silence Satan than the shofar itself. That's Rameir Simcha Vince. Okay? But the Aruch LaNer writes, well, what happens if we don't observe the Shabbos appropriately throughout the year? You know what happens? The only reason why we say we don't blow the shofar is to honor God's glory, which is Shabbos. That's the day creation was completed. But yet, what happens to the Jews that don't observe Shabbos properly? So Shabbos comes and Shabbos prosecutes. Here you gave up what? The defense of shofar for my sake. Because it was only a handful, but look how many people are not observing the Shabbos appropriately. Look what's going on in this world. Therefore, the year that we don't have the shofar because of Shabbos, very often that year is the most tragic year. That's the Aruch LaNer. That will be the most tragic year. Because since you didn't have the defense on Rosh Hashanah to silence Satan, and the only defense is covered Shabbos. So if you don't address Shabbos properly, you're left helpless, wide open. And that's why all the tragedies throughout the year happened during that year that Shabbos, Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos. That's the Aruch LaNer. This year was disastrous on every level for Klal Yisrael and for the world at large. The Midas Adin, which we're experiencing now, is pre-World War anti-Semitism, literally on the college campuses in Europe, in the United States, all over. And it's going from bad to worse. This is all part of what? Of the flawed record, which was not silenced, and therefore it was prosecuted. In Shemona Esrei, it's divided in 3 parts. The first 3 brachos we speak about Hashem himself. Who is he? Akela Godla, Giba, Norab, Chalkachayim Bechesed, Ato Kodosh. And then we begin the section of what? Of supplication. You supplicate Hashem for our needs. In the first 3 brachos, there's no requests. So there's a question which is asked. We say, Zochreinu l'chaim, melech b'chaim, chosveinu b'chayim. We make a request. Why during the Aseres Meitshuva, if we're not permitted to make a request during the first 3 brachos of the Amidah, how do we say it? We say make certain requests. The question is asked by the Rishonim, by the earlier commentators. So the one of 2 answers given. The Ramah rules in Shulchan Aruch that if you have a person who's a Godel Ador who's not well, you're permitted to make a request even during the first 3 brachos, because he's vital for Klal Yisrael. Because he's vital for Klal Yisrael as being a Torah leader, a Torah sage. It has that degree of importance that even during the first 3 brachos, you insert and you make that supplication for him. We're talking about, it's Aser Shemei Tshuva. We're in a position from Rosh Hashanah through Yom Kippur, very precarious. We have the ultimate opportunity simultaneously. If it doesn't happen as it should happen, it's disastrous. Therefore, we begin immediately on Rosh Hashanah, Zocheinu l'chaim, even during the first 3 brachos. That's, the others say it a little more sharply. We're in a state of pikuach nefesh. If it's pikuach, if the community, not on Torah say, let's say the community is in danger. The community is going to be annihilated. You insert that request even during the first 3 brachos. During the Aseres Meitshuva, we're literally walking on thin ice, walking that tightrope. And because of that, the seriousness of the moment, chas v'sholom, if it doesn't go the right way, it's disastrous. That's why we insert Zochreinu l'chaim, el chovetz b'chaim, chosem sefer chaim, madchel keep chaim, for that reason. That's the seriousness of these days. So again, the reason why they said, so whenever we take something into account, there's a question. If you allow the people to blow shofar Rosh Hashanah, somebody may transport it. You want to know something? But if it's pikuach nefesh, if you don't blow the shofar, it's pikuach nefesh for Klal Yisrael. We need that defense system in place to silence Satan. So even though the handful may do it, doesn't make a difference. Blow the shofar for the sake of all pikuach nefesh. So they said, because since there's an element of Shabbos that's even more powerful than the shofar, that compensates for the shofar, therefore, we don't blow the shofar. That took the edge off of it. You understand? It's not, it was part of the original say, well, Shabbos it has that force. No, it would have been, if it didn't have that other aspect, they wouldn't even consider it. Even if a few people would have violated Shabbos, we're instead of Pikuach Nefesh. Pikuach Nefesh, you blow the shofar. We're not concerned somebody may transport the shofar. Like in Eretz Yisrael, we add 18 minutes before, candlelight is 18 minutes before sundown. That's called Tosefes Shabbos. In Yerushalayim, they already light candles, many people 40 minutes before sundown. And Rav Shneiman and many people, they suggest when a person had a problem, they should be Makabel Shabbos, they should accept Shabbos 40 minutes before, not 18 minutes. And not only that, they suggested people should study Hilchos Shabbos during the week. And the discourse of observing Shabbos, that will correct many things. That'll silence prosecution. But it was always back to the Shabbos. Because again, whatever it is, not observing the Shabbos is the ultimate desecration of God. Why? Because here God finished creation. And God descends into existence. That's the basis for Kedusha Shabbos. The king is present in everyone's house. How do you behave this way? What do you think we say to Yikum Purkon? Ashkenaz will say Yikum Purkon on Shabbos. We don't say it on Yom Tov. The answer is because here the Shekhinah is present in our home. Hashem is coming to our existence. How do you behave this way? It's the ultimate level of disrespect. How are you even worried about the weekday worries when Hashem's here? So therefore we say Yikum Purkon to compensate for that shortcoming. We ask for Rachmim, despite that, we ask for Rachmei Hashem.
But Rabbi,
I'm,
just want
You imagine the king comes to your house and they say, where's the person? Where's the resident? He's out on the golf course playing golf. They say, if he knew the king was coming, what's he out playing golf? The answer is he doesn't value the king's presence. You know, the king says, if that's the case, I'm not coming. I can take that as more than a personal slight. Therefore, there's a very serious reaction to that. A person sits in the Shabbos table and he's not ecstatic. He's not besimcha. Shabbos, Kedusha Shabbos. What's the problem? You know, I had some kind of financial thing during the week. I can't get myself out of my doldrums. You just won the $1 billion lottery. You lost 5 cents during the week. What are you sulking over 5 cents? That's exactly what it is. If you relate to what Shabbos is, that's Me'ein Olam Haba. It's a semblance of the world to come because Hashem enters into our lives on Shabbos. You should be ecstatic. And how do you talk about business? How do you do many things that we shouldn't do? We're talking about the observant Jew, or the one who should know better. Therefore, we say, Kum Purkon, that despite our shortcomings, because we're so far out of touch, although we should know better, have Rachmim on us, reinstate our health, give us sight, give us children, protect us, that we should be able to thrive despite all our shortcomings. That's the basis of Kum Purkon.